Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon session dedicated to financing negative emission in the context of achieving the Paris Agreement. In other words, carbon neutrality by mid-century. Well, the announcement of Japan and China recently are certainly good news, and we're hoping for similar good news from the US, obviously, shortly. We will spend the next 75 minutes together, but before then, please let me remind you that you can leave your laptop and mobile open as long as it's on silence mode. It's actually going to be your only way to ask questions, and we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of this session. We will have the chance to get insights from great speakers, particularly involved in facilitating, developing, financing negative emissions for the sake of investors, companies willing to decarbonize. In Paris, but unfortunately not with us because of cas contact, Émilie Alberola leads the RI Research and Innovation team within the EcoAct Group, now a company of Atos Group. Online, we have, from London, Martin Berg, who is partner at Pollination, developing ideas for investment in natural capital and carbon markets. We also have from Quebec, Claude Le Tourneau, who is the CEO of Svante, a technology firm developing a second-generation post-combustion carbon capture technology, and Mark Sadler from the World Bank, who is the manager of the Climate Funds Management Unit. Needless to say that there are some good things to take out of this pandemic, because we can bring together people from different sides of the Atlantic or the Channel with a quite limited carbon footprint. But well, let's go to our point. Actually, negative emission is not new. Research published in Nature in 2015 warned that all scenarios for keeping global temperature rise to 2 degrees require negative emissions. So removing CO2 from the atmosphere to store it in land, underground, or in the ocean. Here is a figure from the IPCC report 1.5 degree that was released in 2018 that actually confirmed this study released in 2015, meaning it's comforted by the scientist community. The first scenario, the lead one, refers to low energy demand. It's very challenging scenario. One that we more often relate to is the EST one, scenario one, which actually refers to limiting to 1.5 degrees of warming and means 95% cut in CO2 emissions by 2050 relative to 2010, and this one actually translates into removing 150 billion metric tons of CO2 from the atmosphere out of the air, with limited rollout of this technology by around 2040. So, a simple question to take a little step back on this scenario. Do you find it realistic? And if not, that means that the amount of CO2 emission that we're going to have to remove from the atmosphere will be even bigger. Jumping to the S5 scenario, it's actually a scenario where the lifestyle, intensive emitting lifestyle of the US is generalized in the world, and that means that we have to rely almost exclusively on removing CO2 from the atmosphere to achieve 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. Remember, 1.5 degrees of warming translates into 80% of Greenland melting down and almost all of the marine ecosystem collapse. So the long and short of it all is that if you're interested in returning to a natural climate equilibrium, you've got to find a plan that does more than just reduce carbon pollution. It has to aggressively reverse it. Not just climate mitigation and adaptation, it's climate restoration. So concretely, what does that mean? Well, obviously, you still have positive emissions, and you have to drastically reduce emission through renewable energy, energy efficiency, changing behavior, changing business models, and carbon capture. It's the yellow zone on this graph. And you have also to retrieve it from the atmosphere, so it's carbon removal, it's below, it's in the gray area here, and it's made up largely of nature-based solutions, but not only, as it also includes technologies such as direct air capture or microalgae to fuel, or biocar, to name only a few. In between, you have the hard-to-abate sectors, which need carbon capture and removal to limit their emissions as soon as possible and support the transition pathway. Well, thankfully, an increasing number of companies, countries, institutions, cities are committing to carbon neutrality and will need carbon capture and removal to limit their emissions as soon as possible. Fact is, net zero climate plans will need billion, trillion tons of CO2 to be put out of the atmosphere, because without decisive and drastic carbon removal, natural reabsorption of extra CO2 would take way too long to come back to the equilibrium we need to thrive. So to make it even simpler, it's not a question of investing in carbon energy efficiency, in carbon reduction, or in negative emission. We absolutely need to do both to ensure the resilience of the natural ecosystems now. And the financial industry can help in this pathway. Well, by deploying more capital and restricting capital. So finance have a focus on risk and reward, and it's actually key to build a future that prioritizes resilience, social mobility, and the environment alongside economic growth. To achieve the scale of change needed to meet the Paris Agreement, we need, again, to be at carbon zero by 2050 or sooner, and so it will need significant effort also from the financial industry. That means aligning our own finance emission to carbon zero for our bank's portfolio of customers. That's actually what the group HSBC has announced at the beginning of October this year. It has the ambition, commit to be carbon neutral for its balance sheet by 2050. It also commits to use the PACTA methodology to determine the pathway that it develops for this carbon neutrality and provide up to $1 trillion of investment and financing to the transition of its customers. It also commits to create different funds, including having the ambition to be a leader in natural capital manager with the announcement of a joint venture with Pollination. And obviously, to be able to reach all those ambitions, it needs to build the solutions with its stakeholders. And it's one of the reasons why we propose today to have this conversation with the great panelists today. So now let's jump into the discussion, turning to our great panelists. And to start with, I will ask each of the speakers to tell us in a few words your role regarding negative emissions. And Emily, do you want to start?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Marine, for your invitation, and thank you very much for your very useful introduction about negative emission. So I'm working at EcoAct, which is an international consulting company and project developer, helping businesses and organizations succeed in their climate ambition. We have an experienced and dedicated nature-based solution team, which helps companies to support and develop climate projects. We are working on financing negative emissions through offsetting projects developed at the international and local level, such as in France, for instance. We are working on offsetting projects developing different types of nature-based solutions in agriculture, in forestry, and other land use projects. Let me maybe just at the start of the discussion at this stage to specify what it's called carbon removal or negative emission does not encompass all sorts of activities in what we call nature-based solution. Only projects that enhance the amount of carbon stored in the natural carbon sink concern negative emission. Forest conservation through REDD+, for instance, avoid carbon emission, whereas afforestation, wetlands creation, improved forest management remove extra carbon units from the atmosphere. So at EcoAct, we have several projects, a series of projects of various activities in REDD+, in Asia, in Africa, for instance, and removals also in planting mangrove, for instance, in Myanmar, in Kenya, in Panama also we have projects. So as you mentioned, we want to achieve net zero emission without negative emission. This is a key thing. As you mentioned, Marine, it's about 2 gigatons that must come from negative emission if we would like to achieve this target of 2 degrees. And 2 gigaton is greater amount. This is the emission of Brazil or Japan, for instance, the world's 6th or 7th largest emitters in the world. And as you mentioned also, emission reduction must be the first priority for all players, countries, corporates, individuals, in all cases where it's technical and economical feasible. But carbon offset markets, I think, can have a role to play in supporting emission reduction and emission removals also, where it's no economic case. So EcoAct is involved in this direction to develop offsetting projects that can help to accelerate financing negative emission action. And I will develop more in the next minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emilie. Martin, can I give you the floor?
Yes, thank you very much, Marine. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. Martin Berg, my name. I'm working for Pollination, which is a global advisory and investment firm with offices in Australia, Europe, and the United States. I was building out the investment side, and I had the pleasure to work with his colleagues. I think there's some feedback, right? Is this better? Marine, is this better or not? I'm trying again.
No, it's working.
So
Yep.
It's working. Okay, sorry about this.
No problem.
So I had the pleasure to work with Marine's colleagues at HSBC to negotiate a joint venture, which is solely focused on bringing the natural capital theme more mainstream to really develop a large-scale investment product for institutional investors. And I'll talk about this and the market positioning a bit later on.
Thank you very much. Mark? And maybe I'm going to show one of your slides.
Okay, hopefully. There's only 2 slides. We managed to reduce the number of slides, so that's good news. Thanks ever so much for the invitation to come and talk today. The bank's involved in a number of different ways in climate finance. Obviously, with our own balance sheet, we move approximately $20–30 billion a year in climate-related finance. We manage a large number of activity-based financial products from other suppliers, for example, the Green Climate Fund, and then results-based finance. And here are examples of some of the results-based funds that we actually currently manage So these are involved in pre-2020 and post-2020 crediting regimes. And as you can see from this slide, specifically two of those funds, the Forest Carbon Partnership, which is a red plus, but obviously that also includes afforestation, and the Biocarbon Fund, which is an integrated land use fund, where you're looking at jurisdictional crediting from all sources related to forestry, but also agriculture. And then some of the other funds also get involved in that nature-based space and carbon. So that's basically the big picture of where we are. We did about $2 billion under the Kyoto pre-2020. We're currently managing around $2 to $3 billion of results-based finance post-2020 crediting.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I understand that the World Bank is actually involved in about 95% of the RED Plus projects that were financed up to now. Claude.
Bonjour, Marine. Nice meeting you all panelists. Thank you for the invitation. Achieving net zero carbon emission is the most fundamental and difficult task to stabilize the climate. Leaders from government, industry, and financial sector all debate the enormity of the challenge to deploy at gigaton scale. So, let's get a few things straight. Carbon pulled from the earth needs to go back into the earth. Volume are huge. 10 gigaton per year is equivalent to the market size of the oil industry in reverse. So we need to develop a physical market for CO2 management. We call this the CO2 marketplace. So several options are available. We've talked about nature-based, or you can do engineered solution. So Svante is an engineered solution, both for the top and bottom of your curve, so being point source capture from cement or blue hydrogen, or direct air capture. We play on both sides. So Svante is the only portfolio company that the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative investment group made in carbon capture technology development.
Thank you very much, Claude. And discussing with you earlier, what I understand from our conversation is actually we need a price on carbon to develop that that market, and the price you were referring to was around $100 to $150 per ton. You mentioned also the emergence of the new industry that you call the CO2 management. So can you please expand on this and explain to us who would be the different parties involved in it?
Yeah, if you switch to the next slide. So the issue is about creating a commercial framework where policies, finance, and industry players are all aligned and making money. So how do they play together is the issue. So it's about developing a CO2 marketplace where you have a supply and demand, and where there's a conversion on the price at around $100 to $150 per ton. So if you slip the next slide, there is a demand side where companies are pledging for net zero carbon emission because of the consumer pressure. So these companies are primarily coming from the data management industry and the consumer product, like Amazon and Microsoft. You've seen them doing net zero pledge. And then these companies will push down carbon emission reduction to their supply chain with certified partners. So that's on the demand side. On the supply side, you have large industrial carbon reduction or carbon removal project coming from different technology providers like us. And in the middle, you need basically an industry that will transport the CO2 and store the CO2 on the ground. And it'll be coming from the oil and gas industry primarily. And they're creating, as we speak, hubs around the world capable of storing gigaton scale of CO2. And then you have the energy provider who will provide the energy to energize these carbon capture plants because they need energy, and most of it will be coming from renewable, which is hydro, geothermal, and solar for electricity supply for these capture plants. So the voluntary price on carbon of $100 is basically the key driver to basically bring money into that industry so that people can make money. And we believe it will be done through a progressive tax credit or carbon tax that may create a tipping fee. And then there'll be a voluntary price on carbon that will be embedded in the cost of goods sold from consumer product. So we know all about the life cycle analysis, what we call the LCA of every goods and services. There's another concept being used now by countries called the border carbon adjustment, which will be the norm in the near future. And both the LCA and the border carbon adjustment will basically impose a carbon price on greenhouse emission for product to be imported from one country to the other. So the BCA provides an avenue, I think, for countries to have a direct way to influence the global climate policy. And it will be embedded into the imports of other countries. So just to conclude, as a result, the BCA, I think, will create a powerful incentive for countries to impose their strong climate policy. And the pledge that major companies are currently making to net zero by 2030 or 2040 will create a market pull that will lower the carbon footprint of goods and services to support consumer product and services.
Thank you very much, Claude. And actually, you touched on something that I would like to ask now to Mark. It's actually environmental integrity when we talk about buying carbon offsets or carbon reduction from one country to another, so cross borders. Mark?
And you went straight to the really complicated stuff. So, I'm not sure if this is a good time to show that slide or not, Marianne, but there's a big difference between Kyoto crediting post-2020 and Paris. So the biggest difference is that, of course, under Kyoto, the host countries essentially had no major opportunity costs in enabling the transfer of credits, emissions reductions, or capture out of their territory. Cost in doing that. Under Paris, of course,
sorry, Mark, you were cut. Can you rewind a little bit?
Okay, let me rewind. So essentially, under Kyoto, there was no opportunity cost for a host country in a ton of carbon leaving their borders, because they had no particular targets themselves on the production side. Under Paris, of course, all countries have to have a budget. They have baselines and projections of what their reductions will be. So every ton counts. I think that's the important thing to understand. And if it's actually going to be used as an actual offset in another jurisdiction or country, we need to account for that. And so this is where the complexities come in. They're not complexities that should stop forward motion. They're just things that we have to address.
Thank you very much. Maybe, Martin, when we talk about financing the nature-based solutions, we cannot obviously rely only on carbon cost. I mean, as Emily said, all NBS are not about carbon, and even the ones that are actually removing carbon have very low price of carbon. When Claude was talking about $100 to $150 a ton, here it's more between $3, $5, $10 a ton. Could you tell us how those NBS can be financed?
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you very much, Maureen. Perhaps you could show my first slide. I think I'm hearing echo again. I hope it's working. Is this working, Maureen? So I have okay, I'm trying it.
It's taking a bit. Yep. No, it's this one. Yes, you should have it.
No, it's that one. Perfect. Thank you very much. I think it's absolutely right that when one finances nature-based solution, then we're not only focusing on carbon. I mean, having said that, we shouldn't forget that agriculture and forestry plays a huge role in achieving the Paris Agreement. So we absolutely need to do it. But when we look at investments in nature-based investment, we're actually looking much broader. We're also looking at the environmental component and particularly the biodiversity aspects of this. And what we learned now is, I think we're all seeing it, is that the decline of biodiversity is really real. We already lost 1/8 of our species, and this loss seems to continue. So we really need to find a way not to only address the climate, but also the biodiversity problem. And what we really see now is that investors are increasingly looking to this.
Yeah, and so how does the fact that nature stores carbon comes into play, actually, in your business case?
Well, I mean, it comes into play as one of the revenues, but not necessarily the only revenue. I think what we see is that and you can see this here on the slide, that biodiversity loss is in addition to climate, it has become a very much recognized issue. And so for example, many companies announced now net zero targets, as you said, like HSBC, but many others are also looking really on the issue of biodiversity loss. So for example, 560 companies signed up for Business for Nature. And they have, I think, roughly about 4 trillion of revenues, and 26 for Business for Nature, sorry, and 26 financial institutions, including HSBC, signed up for Finance for Nature. So it's a really interesting trend to see. And if we go on the next slide, that is not only extending to investors, but that is also going on the public side. So you see on the one side, governments now increasingly realizing this with the Leaders Pledge for Nature, and also there's a whole movement to build a task force for nature-related financial disclosures to actually really see the risk aspects of nature that has an impact on companies.
Thank you. And so you are committed to develop natural capital as a new asset class. So what do you see are the main challenges?
What do we see is, it's actually outlined really nicely in the next slide. What do we see at the moment is that the nature-based solution as investment theme is still something that is very difficult to invest for larger scale investors. So we see a lot of smaller, high impact investment ideas, vehicles that score very highly on impact, but are often very too small or not necessarily profitable enough to really attract large-scale investors. On the other side, we're seeing very large investors in agriculture and forestry, but they're not necessarily focused really on nature-based solution or on the impact side. So they have the scale, often they have the profitability, but what they're lacking is really to take this impact thing to the next focus. And what we at HSBC Pollination believe is that there is really a market left for a large-scale investment vehicle that combines the three of them. And that is really something that we want to achieve with our new joint venture. And I can talk maybe about it if you go to the next slide. Marine, you mentioned it earlier today. So I'm still working at Pollination. I'm actually just about to move over to this new joint venture. It's called HSBC Pollination Climate Asset Management. And what we are trying to do is really to develop a leading asset management company, which is an independent company, but owned by HSBC and Pollination. And that is really working on developing large-scale investment products for natural capital.
Thank you very much. Yep, sorry. Thank you very much. And talking about financing nature-based solutions, I mean, certainly, Emilie, what is your view on the demand regarding that?
My view on the demand is that the demand of setting project on negative emission is significantly booming, increasing, because I think all players have understood now that it will be key after reduction to finance negative emission in their scope 1 and 2, and if possible, of course, but also beyond through offsetting projects. So in September, the last report for SBTI, for instance, the recent report on Foundation for Net Zero Targets sitting in the corporate sector, clearly states how removals are key in the future to set the net zero pathway that are current with the IPCC recommendation. So what we can see, there is a growing number of companies that are committed in the net zero ambition, climate neutrality. And we think that the demand for negative emission offsetting project will probably triple by 2030.
Thank you, and maybe I'm going to jump to Mark. I mean, what do you see from the World Bank as far as the demand is concerned from your unit?
So maybe if you could bring the slide up again, because I think that we can talk to some of those pieces. In the post-2020 crediting space, we're seeing a lot of interest both on the sovereign side. So this is countries who have made commitments under their NDCs and won't be able to make those productions themselves. So they're looking to buy to meet their NDC targets. And we're seeing a lot of interest from corporates in actual involvement in offsets, whatever that actually means. And I think that's the challenging thing at the moment. We still use the vocabulary of Kyoto with voluntary offsets. And of course, Paris itself is voluntary. So this issue about how things are based in an NDC, how they are based in a jurisdiction, and then what are the key things that buyers, be they sovereign, private sector, are looking for? What are the fundamental things in that asset? Give them confidence that what they're buying is real and that they can actually use it. And a lot of the things that we're seeing, and they're here on the slide, each one of these become a day-long discussion, not month-long discussion about what they mean. But the technical piece of actually verifying and measuring what that ton is made up of is a very small part of what an asset actually is. So there's the issue of provenance. Who actually owns that asset? And is there a right attached to it to enable it to move within or even outside of a jurisdiction across borders? Environmental and social safeguards, of course, both for sovereign and private sector buyers are of huge importance, especially when we're in the nature-based solutions space. Nature-based solutions is not just about trees, it's mainly about people. And land rights, land issues, and who's actually sharing in the revenue that comes from that asset. So the safeguards is really, really a critical piece. And then this issue about the usage and how we're accounting for it. You know, if I am a company emitting in a country, and under the host country's NDC, I need to reduce my emissions. And I want to do that by bringing in a ton from another country. That immediately puts us into the big accounting game. And at the moment, that's really challenging because we don't actually have the rule book. We don't have everything laid out for Article 6.4. So at the moment, most transactions we're seeing, we would account under Article 6.2, which is basically parties agreeing. So it's not within a strict market infrastructure because we don't have that yet today. But a lot is moving. There's a lot of interest, a lot of liquidity, both on the buy side and on the sell side. It's fantastic news. The key is ensuring that whatever assets we're moving around creating today are real, are countable, accountable, and give confidence to the market. But the worst thing we could do now is to skip some of these important pieces of the asset because we're laying bedrock for the market for later. But we don't want to create assets today that have question marks attached later. And the last quick point I'd make is real challenge here in the nature-based space, because we're not really counting avoidance, we're counting capture, is this issue around permanence. This has been a challenge for the agricultural sector. It's actually where I came out of originally. And soil carbon's a great example of that. the natural carbon cycle, 30 years. So how are we getting permanence? I don't want to buy something today that's going to turn up again tomorrow. It's a very different calculus than avoidance, which is, did it happen? So these are the challenges I think that all managed, especially the tech solutions we have available today, made a huge impact on our ability to verify and monitor. But we need to make sure we put in the building blocks in the right way.
Thank you very much, Mark. And turning to Emily, I mean, how do you see the condition for scalability of those carbon offsets?
The condition on the scalability?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are several conditions. I would say, based on what was underlined by Mark previously, the first one is about the methodology. So it's interesting to see how standards in the voluntary carbon market are currently working in improving and developing robust methodology. So for instance, we have Vera that is currently creating frameworks to enable that RED+ are integrated within state policies. Vera has just published also a new methodology to integrate blue carbon in its methodology on RED+. Gold Standard also just released a methodology to foster carbon finance in the agriculture sectors, and is planning also to publish a new methodology on blue carbon. So this is the first point to make sure that we have strong methodology and robust. The second thing I would say is also to improve the methodology. I'm sorry, I have a big echo when I'm talking. I don't know if it's possible to reduce it, because yeah, no. Okay, so I will continue. It's not a matter. So there is a number of obstacles to overcome. So I talk about the methodology. Probably we have a room also to improve and define new robust methodology, because ecosystem specialists are identifying new ways to enhance carbon storage in natural ways. However, research is, we need now to translate these research results in carbon methodology. On the side of the monitoring tools, probably we have also improvements to follow up the GHG emission store in those natural carbon sinks. We have the issue of the permanence, and Mark talked very well about this key challenge for nature-based solution. On the aspect of the finance, we have the issue of the finance upfront project, because carbon assets are generated after a certain amount of time, and we need to have a funding at the stage of the development of the project. I will highlight also the fact that we are facing regulatory uncertainty at the national level. For instance, we're developing projects in Asia, in Latin America, and we need to understand more what country would like to do with their own national policies. At the international level also, we have this Article 6, and we are waiting the conclusion of the negotiation of this Article 6 in order to understand well what would be possible with the article in order to develop nature-based solution. And maybe at the end, one of the big issue is a market infrastructure. We need to have more transparency on trading. We need to have some massification. This is a good thing. And we have the launch of this international voluntary task force on scaling voluntary carbon market that has been launched by Mark Cartney. This is a good thing, because we think that we need now to scale up this voluntary carbon market towards an effective and efficient and functioning market to help to meet the goals of this Paris Climate Agreement. We are involved in this task force. Our CEO, Gérald Marandan, is involved in this task force. And the objective is to publish this a report, a final report with recommendation at the beginning of the next year in January 2021. So this is a great massification, commodification. However, as was underlined at the beginning of this debate, it shall not be at the cost of the environmental integrity, which is a key issue when we are talking about nature-based solution.
Thank you very much, Emilie. And I would like to turn to you, Claude. I mean, are those frameworks key for the development of your technology? What are the main enabler of scaling up your technology?
It's the three-legged stool. So we need industry players, and I believe that we were able to attract the attention of the oil and gas in working with them in developing our technology, and also look at developing CO2 hubs for the storage, safe storage of CO2. We're now migrating into developing relationship with the financial sector. So we're in a funding raise now, and then we'll be closing shortly with sovereign funds and key players in the CO2 marketplace. So the financial market will now be active into it. What's missing now is progressive tax or policies around the world. And I think I've alluded to the LCA and the BCA, and you know, in the States we have 45Q tax credit that is an enabler of or catalyst to get some of these projects going. At the end of the day, I think we know how to make this. The model has been the one that's been deployed for renewables, where a private-public partnership were put in place to deploy renewable in the early days. I think we need to use the similar model for CO2 management.
Thank you very much. I would like to see if there were questions, but actually I think my system crashed here. So if someone can help me. But before jumping to the question, I mean, I have one, getting back to the financing issues of those negative emissions. I mean, certainly blended finance can play a key role. And talking about blended finance, I'm sure that all of you have an opinion around that, but I would start to revert to Mark and see, I mean, if we understand that the regulation is key for financing them, I mean, how do you see the role of blended finance going forward for financing negative emissions?
Sure, no worries. Look, the amount of capital that we're looking for is not just going to be able to come from the public sector or the private sector. Right? We're going to need to be able to leverage public spending. You know, we're in the middle of the COVID situation, building back green. The choices we make today, where we invest our public money today, will have huge impacts 20, 30 years from now on what those pathways look. So we need to align public finance. We need to ensure that we have the regulation that incentivizes and gives stability and transparency to private capital to enable it to move. But also picking up on a point that came earlier, you know, results-based finance has a role, a very clear role, but you need the activity-based finance in the first place. And you know, we're also advising on this task force on scaling up voluntary markets. And yes, we need the finance market, but that essentially, if we're looking at commodities markets and financial markets in that context, what that's going to give us is price risk management and potentially price discovery. Really important, especially for a mature market to move forward. Of course, having price risk management tools is going to help us unlock some of the capital that's required for activity-based finance, for financing projects, financing things to actually move forward, especially if that price of the underlying fund is going to be part of the profit stack, you know, what the income is going to be for that project. Critically important. But also we need to ensure that private finance moves in the right direction, right? And so these recent moves by both central banks and also TCFD are hugely important. The blended finance option really comes together when you move the regulatory context, the demand for actual commodities, and you actually create this real sweet spot in the middle where private capital can move and have that certainty that it is, it's meeting all the requirements, because it's so difficult being in that financial space. So it will take all of these pieces to come together. On the public sector finance side, trillions of dollars are spent every year. We need to ensure they are all targeted in the right way. A good example of that is the use of subsidies. A great example of how we're in different jurisdictions greening those subsidies is the new agricultural policy in the EU. There you've got alignment between the climate commissioner, the agricultural commissioner, the environmental commissioner, ensuring that public finance flows for things that we want to really happen and happen in the right way. So these are great examples, and we're seeing more and more of them come. But the key comes down to how we align these different sources of finance and not purely rely on results-based finance. It's not just about whether that ton of carbon is going to be made. Without all the other finance, we won't get to that ton. It all has to come together, and that really is blended action.
Thank you very much. And maybe, Martin, coming from the EIB, what's your view on the role of blended finance into developing that new asset class?
Yeah, no, thank you. And maybe if I could jump back on the whole discussion on the carbon markets, and I just wanted to say a few words on that as well. And I fully agree with Mark. I think the biggest difference at the moment is that we, sorry, I'll have an echo as well. So the biggest difference is that at the moment, the emissions market is still seen in the same way as the Kyoto market, but especially on nature-based solutions, what we see is that a lot of the companies with a net zero target, they're actually moving ahead anyway through an investment-led approach. And they're looking much less, and is there an opportunity to actually gain offsets that I can hold in a registry? What they're looking for is some form of compensation. They want to have real emission reductions. They want to have ways to assess this and also to monitor this. But they are less interested in actually receiving carbon credits that they can then use for some form of compliance, because in the end, the net zero target is not for compliance, it's voluntary. And so I think there will be a huge shift in the market, that we may be going away from the thinking I need an offset, but much more I need a corresponding verifiable emission reduction somewhere that I can actually really report on. So that's maybe on the emission reductions. Can you hear me, Marine?
Yes, very well. I was just checking for the,
perfect.
yeah. No
Perfect. Then on the blended finance, I also have to say, I have to agree with Mark. I think that we should use blended finance really as a last resort. What we need is regulation. And I think it's really important to stress, if we had a functioning system now for either under an Article 6 or under some domestic regime, then we would be in a completely different situation. We see this in those markets. For example, I can give you an example. In Australia, you have now you have carbon companies actually very active. They are being purchased by larger financial institutions at the moment because there's some regulation in place. There's a price signal. The moment you install this, you have the financial sector coming in, and we see this. We see this in those markets where it works. In California, it works to some extent as well. We have a price signal in Europe, and you see immediately financing is actually flowing. So we should be careful to use blended finance to basically replace regulation. In the end, that is the key driver for environmental markets, and we should not forget that. But having said that, I also fully agree. There are situations where blended finance can really help to test new business models. For example, on nature-based solutions, one of the issues is not only that we don't have a low carbon price, but also we have so many other benefits that don't have a price. Nature is in a way priceless at the moment, unfortunately, but we know it provides a lot of services. And there are more and more studies that now show this. So using blended finance there to really help to demonstrate this and allow projects to be financed that then can demonstrate the multiple benefits and actually show the value of that, I believe is really helpful.
Yes, thank you very much. And I understand that the demand is strong. The framework is not very solid yet. We're waiting a lot from the Article 6, but also from the task force that you mentioned, Emily, that was launched by IIF and Mark Carney on scaling up the voluntary carbon offset market. And just for your information, it's going to be released quite soon for public consultation before the final paper that will be released actually in January with an action plan for implementation. There's also the question, I mean, we've touched on that with Claude, of the developers, and if the demand is strong, the supply needs also that framework. And we see it, for example, in France, and maybe Emilie, coming back to you, we have a specific framework in France that was actually most needed to develop part of that market here, and I would like you to explain a little bit how it's shaped and what is the actual impact.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, yeah, in France, the French Ministry for Ecology and Inclusive Transition, in collaboration with several partners, create this label bas carbone. This is a low carbon April, launched in April 2019. In order to support the development of carbon project, local carbon project in France. So this is an innovative and transparent framework offering development and funding opportunities for local voluntary projects in reduction, but also in sequestration. In this context, we are working at EcoAct with I4C, Institute for Climate Economics and Climate Kick, to develop the first methodology for mangrove restoration in French insular territories. The objective is to develop a first pilot project in Martinique this year, and in Guadeloupe and Mayotte also by 2021 and 2022. What is interesting with this first project is that this project enables us to pinpoint the potential to scale up blue carbon restoration project in France. And we are currently working with some private funds in order to draft new methodology to test first project on seagrasses, on peatlands, marshes, and other biomes that needs to be better protected and, of course, restored also.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard me well.
Yes, we hear you very well.
I have a terrible echo.
Maybe an additional question is how much this label is picked up by farmers, for example, on the French territory.
I don't hear you very well.
I mean, my question, an additional
on the
question.
label.
Yes, yeah. On the label bas carbone. The
yes.
impact of actually this new label on the development of regenerative agriculture in France, on the French territory.
Yes, so we have two methodology on the agricultural sectors that allows to develop a project in order to protect and restore the land use in France. So this is a very interesting project, and I think HSBC, maybe you could be more able to develop exactly the development of this project in agriculture. You are involved in the...
We're looking at it yet, for the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to turn to the questions, but actually I'm not sure if there are any, because the tablet doesn't work here. But maybe before I receive any, I turn to you, panelists. You may have a question from one to the other, and to launch that, maybe I have one for Claude. We're hearing a lot about the direct air capture technology, seeing from my seat a great appetite from the US territory, seeing it as a good potential technology going forward. There has been some initiative in Europe, and I think of one from Suez. What is your view regarding direct air capture technology?
I think this is a complementary technology to the point source capture. You need to do both. You need to reduce flatten the curve, as we say in the CO2 market first, and then the residual of CO2 that will be emitted by the industry needs to be coming from the inventory of CO2 we have in the atmosphere. So this is very complementary. They have both to be done. There's a price point that is different, obviously, when you have a source of CO2 from a cement plant at 16% CO2, it's less costly than doing it at 0.04% in the atmosphere. But both of them, I think, will converge into a price point that we can afford as a society around $100 per ton.
Yeah, thank you, Claude. Maybe one question for each of you. What would be for you the game changer, if there's one, to scale up your activity? Emily, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I think the last initiative launched with this task force is a very good step. And it can be a game changer because when you put around the table the main players in the financial side on the market infrastructure providers, buyers and suppliers of carbon offsets in order to make sure that we move towards an effective, efficient and functioning voluntary carbon market, I think it can be a game changer. So we are very interested by this task force and we're waiting with a high interest the recommendation that will be published in this report.
Thank you. Claude?
You know, CO2 is a waste byproduct of our economy, yes? And we need to find, it's not a technology challenge anymore. I think we've cracked the code and there's plenty of companies like ours who know how to do this thing and the price point that the society can afford. The issue now is to crack the code of how to monetize the CO2. And I believe when we do so, we will unlock the greatest investment opportunity of our century. Remember, storing CO2 alone, which is one step of the value chain, is reversing the oil and gas industry in terms of economical value, just for 10 gigaton. We're looking now at 40 gigaton being emitted every year. Of course, there'll be renewables and economy efficiencies and nature-based to reduce that curve, flatten that curve, but there'll be residual, and it's going to be in the range of 10 to 20 or even 40 gigaton, 2 to 3 times the size of the oil and gas industry. Think about it.
Thank you, Claude. Martin?
Yeah, I completely agree actually with that statement. I think what we need to do is we need to find ways to price in the environmental externalities. So we're starting with carbon on the one hand, also with environmental externalities, especially related to nature. And I think the moment we have a price, then we can actually move finance at this speed. And that's what we've seen in the markets where this has been done. And I think at the moment the real difficulty is that there is a lot of interest. Everybody knows that probably the carbon price will be higher in the future. However, at the moment there are very little prices around the world in order to for immediate action. So I think we need to fix this, and I would even extend this not only to the carbon side, but also to biodiversity and some of the other environmental assets. And I think that's what I would urge the regulatory framework should focus on.
Maybe before asking Martin, what do you expect from the COP15?
Well, I think we are not there yet. It's the challenge with biodiversity. You mean the biodiversity COP, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. The challenge with biodiversity is that it's difficult to just define one target. On climate, it's a little bit more straightforward because we have CO2. What target should we use as a world community to move towards for the biodiversity? It gets very complicated, as you know. You're one of the experts in that field. So I think what I really expect is a recognition that we have to find a way to actually, as a world community, move towards really halting this process of biodiversity decline. And we probably have to really work firstly on the type of metrics that we can use in order to measure that. But I think the most important part is, and the leaders' pledge is there, if we have more countries signing up to then I think technologically solutions can be found. So there's always the same movement. I think first there is the push for really that the problem is identified, and I think we're seeing now so much literature coming out from so many sides that the problem is there. Then we need the policy side to really acknowledge it, and then we can really look for the solutions. And I think we're hopefully just before the second one.
Thank you. Mark, what could be a game changer for scaling up financing of negative emissions?
I think the key here is for us to focus on not just one silver bullet, but what they call silver buckshot. Right? We're going to need a lot of things and not just focusing on one. The issue of crediting the other co-benefits, and this is a critical point, especially in the nature-based space. I couldn't agree with Martin and others more. An idea 20 years ago at the beginning of Kyoto was around basically credit stacking, where you had a carbon piece of the credit, you have a water piece of the credit, you have a gender piece of the credit. And we're working on those types of things at the moment, and actually seeing how the different pieces of finance can flow at different times to those buyers who are interested in those things. So that's a piece of innovation that I think will come, has to come. We're working on it, and so a lot of others. The second one, I think, at the moment, in the middle of the regulatory uncertainty in the international processes, is we need to find programmatic and pragmatic ways to just move forward. Right? The momentum is there. Solar is cheaper than coal in nearly all jurisdictions. You need to just find pragmatic ways forward. And to be honest, under the international architecture, that's available anyway. You know, Article 6.2 is where two governments come together and they agree. You know, Peru and Switzerland just signed a landmark agreement, and that's in the absence of 6.4 being agreed. So let's find where we can work on it. I think the important thing in this conversation, because there's a challenge in this as well, right? Where the conversation about offset becomes ahead and bigger than the conversation about real low carbon development. And these things have to go together, right? The offsets have to be a transition answer. It cannot be the final answer. If we just going to keep on emitting everything that we're emitting at 40 gigs or more, and we're not actually producing that, offsets won't get us there. We're stuck in this awful catch-22. The offsets play a role, and I think we need to be really focused on what are those options. And we're working at the bank on other things, such as a meta registry that would actually connect the different registries to enable product discovery, warehouse, and also a club where you bring governments together where they can agree on how they're going to transact with each other in the absence necessarily of agreement today. But our encouragement, as an institution with our clients, is let's find ways to make this work. Let's push the capital from both public and private sides and focus on what we can get done. Because the more that we do, the better that influences international discussions and gets us closer. Because these targets are like tomorrow. These are not 50 years from now. We have to make serious reductions and do serious things by 2030. That's right round the corner.
Thank you very much. The message is clear. I mean, there's a lot of companies, cities, countries that are committing to carbon neutrality. So the demand for moving fast and seriously is there. The supply is there too. The mean to meet the demand and supply is under construction. And as you said, there's certainly no silver bullet, and obviously the Mark Carney task force is well placed in the equation. I mean, before closing that panel, if in one sentence you would like our audience to remind something important about financing negative emissions, what would you say? And let's start with Mark.
It's part of the economy. It's part of a low carbon economy. This isn't something unusual. This is our future. This is what we need to do to keep the planet going.
Thanks, Mark. Martin?
I think the time for nature-based solutions and for natural capital is now. So we're seeing lots of momentum, and I think we have to build on that together with investors and with governments to make it work.
Thank you, Claude.
You know, when we buy electric vehicle, we get subsidies to deploy the electric vehicles. When you do the math, you pay $1,000 per ton for CO2. When we deploy renewable the same way, it's been done through public partnership, and there's a price to it. So I don't think the management of collecting CO2 from the air or industrial and putting it underground has been truly evaluated. We're judging it on the real cost. The other ones are not. So we need LCAs and BCAs to establish the rules of engagement so we can develop this business.
Thank you. Emilie?
Yes, as you mentioned, we're at a turning point, and I think the current key issue is to scale up this current voluntary carbon market by gathering all conditions we discussed this afternoon, such as the market robustness, the transparency, the trading infrastructure, standardization, the link with Article 6 and the corresponding adjustment, but also the digitalization that can also reduce the cost to ensure that it can succeed in scaling up the funding towards offset project on nature-based solution, on negative emission, which bring huge co-benefits beyond carbon. I think it's really important to keep in mind that also. Thanks. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. And certainly it's not the end of the conversation or the topic. And if you want to go further, I wanted to show the last slide. It's about the HSBC Center of Sustainable Finance, where we release constantly new research that we lead or that we support from external parties. And here are two that you may be interested in. One on CCUS for Paris alignment, and another one, a white paper on building a voluntary carbon offsets market. I would like to thank again my great panel and applaud. And thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you, Marine.
Thank you very much, Marine, and all of our speakers on this carbon neutrality session.